The stagecoach lurched to a grinding halt in a cloud of red dust, and Gertrude Barrett stepped off into a town she had never heard of, carrying a carpetbag in one hand and a crumpled letter in the other. The name, Millhaven, written clearly at the top of the page, except the sign nailed to the post in front of her read Copper Creek, population 312, in sun-bleached letters that had been there so long the wood had warped around them. She stood perfectly still on the wooden boardwalk for a moment, her green eyes moving from the sign to the letter and back again, the dry Kansas wind pulling at the hem of her traveling dress, which had once been a respectable shade of navy blue but had faded over the 2 days she had spent rattling across the open plains inside a stagecoach that smelled of tobacco and boot leather. The year was 1878, and Gertrude Barrett was 24 years old, and she was supposed to be getting married in approximately 4 hours. She folded the letter slowly and pressed it flat against her palm. The man she was supposed to marry, a cattle broker by the name of Edmund Fitch, was waiting for her in Millhaven, which was, according to the stagecoach driver who was already unhitching the horses and paying her absolutely no attention, somewhere north of here, possibly 2 days' ride or possibly more, depending on which trail you took and how the weather held. "Excuse me," she said to the driver, a heavy-set man with a sunburned neck and no particular interest in anything that was not directly related to horses or whiskey. "I believe I may have boarded the wrong coach in Dodge City." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "What town you headed to?" "Millhaven." He sucked his teeth. "That's North Line. You wanted the Tuesday stage. This is the Wednesday stage." "It is Wednesday," she said carefully. "Wednesday South Line," he said, as though this clarified everything perfectly, and then he turned back to his horses. Gertrude looked down at her carpetbag. She looked at the letter. She looked at the sign that said Copper Creek. She had been raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a house with a proper parlor and a mother who had very strong opinions about punctuality, and she had never in her 24 years felt quite so completely and utterly lost as she did standing on this boardwalk in the Kansas heat with the sun directly overhead and dust on her shoes. It was at that precise moment that she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, a measured and unhurried stride that spoke of a man who was not in a particular rush, because he had decided where he was going and was simply going there. And she turned instinctively just as George Holloway came around the corner of the general store, with a paper-wrapped parcel of horseshoe nails under one arm, and a look of calm concentration on his face that dissolved almost immediately into something between surprise and a kind of focused attention she would think about much later. He was tall and lean in the particular way that men who spent their days outdoors tended to be, not lean from want but lean from work, with broad shoulders and hands that had clearly spent many years doing things that required both strength and steadiness. He wore a worn brown hat and a shirt the color of the sky just after a storm, and he had brown eyes that caught the sunlight and held it for just a moment longer than seemed ordinary. He stopped when he saw her, not abruptly, but in the way that a man stops when something unexpected catches his attention, and he takes a moment to understand it before he moves on. Except he did not move on. "You look," he said, and then paused, and she got the sense that he was choosing his words with some care, like someone who might be needing some assistance. "I stepped off the wrong stagecoach," she said. She was not a woman who saw any particular value in pretending that a problem was not a problem. "I was meant to arrive in Millhaven today. I am instead in Copper Creek. I have a carpetbag, a letter of introduction, and approximately no idea what to do next." He studied her for a moment with those steady brown eyes, and then he set the parcel of horseshoe nails down on a barrel beside him. "George Holloway," he said. "I run the Holloway Ranch about 3 miles east of here." "Gertrude Barrett," she said. "I am, as of approximately this morning, a bride without a bridegroom or a town." Something moved across his face that she might have described, had she been inclined toward dramatic language, as the beginning of a smile, though it had not quite arrived there yet. "That's a difficult situation," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I am trying to determine whether I should be distressed or pragmatic about it, and I find I am leaning toward pragmatic, though I reserve the right to be distressed later." "That seems sensible," he said, and this time the smile did arrive, briefly, and with a warmth to it that was entirely genuine. "Come on inside the hotel and have something cold to drink. The stagecoach for the North Line doesn't come through until Friday." She blinked. "Friday. Friday," he confirmed. "It's Wednesday. Wednesday South Line," she murmured. "Exactly." She picked up her carpetbag and followed George Holloway into the establishment across the street, which was called the Copper Creek Hotel, and served both as the town's primary lodging and as the site of its most reliable meals, prepared by a woman named Alma Gentry who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely. The interior was dim and cool after the heat of the street, with a long wooden bar along one wall and a dining area with 4 round tables covered in oilcloth, and Alma Gentry herself standing behind the bar with her arms crossed in a posture that was fundamentally welcoming despite appearing to be the opposite. "George," she said, "who's this?" "This is Miss Gertrude Barrett," he said, setting his parcel on the bar. "She stepped off the south stage by mistake. She needs a room until Friday." Alma looked at Gertrude with the kind of thorough and comprehensive assessment that could cover a person's entire history in about 4 seconds flat. "You're not from Kansas," she said. "Ohio," Gertrude said. "Cincinnati." "Long way from Cincinnati," Alma said, and reached under the bar for a ceramic pitcher. "Sit down. I'll get you some lemonade." George pulled out one of the chairs at the nearest table and gestured toward it, and Gertrude sat, setting her carpetbag on the floor and her letter on the table in front of her, and she took a breath for what felt like the first time since the stagecoach had stopped. The room smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and something baking, and it was, in spite of everything, comforting. George sat across from her, not because she had asked him to, but because it seemed, in some quiet and unannounced way, that neither of them had finished talking yet. "Millhaven," he said. "That's where Edmund Fitch operates." She looked up from the letter. "You know him?" "I know of him," George said, and something in the way he said it was careful in a way that suggested the full sentence had more to it. "He runs cattle brokerage, buys and sells stock for other ranchers, takes a commission on both ends. He wrote to me through the arrangements agency in Cincinnati," Gertrude said. "He described himself as a gentleman of means with a productive enterprise and a desire for companionship." George looked at the table for a moment. "That's one description." She set the letter down. "What would be another?" He met her eyes directly, and she found that she appreciated this about him. He did not look away from direct questions the way that men sometimes did when they were deciding how much to tell you. "A man who enjoys his advantages and is not always careful about how he comes by them," he said. "I don't want to speak badly of a man I don't know well, but I've heard enough." Alma appeared with 2 cups and the lemonade pitcher and poured without being asked. She did not leave immediately after, which told Gertrude that Alma Gentry had also heard enough and had her own opinions about it. "He's been through Copper Creek twice in the past year," Alma said, sitting down at the end of the table as though she had been invited. "Both times he was collecting money from ranchers for stock sales he'd apparently managed. The first time everything was fine. The second time, there was a dispute about whether the figures he presented matched the actual sale prices." "Was it resolved?" Gertrude asked. "It was smoothed over," Alma said, "which is not the same thing." Gertrude looked at the letter in front of her. Edmund Fitch had written it in a neat, educated hand, describing a comfortable home and a bright future and his eagerness to welcome a wife of good character and capable disposition. He had sounded on paper like a man of substance. He had not sounded like a man whose accounts did not add up. "I have accepted his proposal by letter," she said. "The arrangements have been made." "Arrangements can be unmade," George said quietly. She looked at him. "Can they?" "They can," he said. But that's a decision that belongs to you." There was nothing pushy in the way he said it. He was not telling her what to do. He was simply, clearly and steadily, making sure she understood that she had choices. And something about that clarity, coming from a man she had known for approximately 15 minutes in a town she had never intended to visit, was more reassuring than anything she had expected to find when she stepped off that stagecoach. She drank her lemonade. The afternoon light shifted through the single window and fell across the oilcloth on the table, and outside, Copper Creek went about its Wednesday business, and Gertrude Barrett began, very slowly, to reconsider everything. Over the following 2 days, Gertrude discovered that Copper Creek was a town with a great deal going on beneath its modest surface. It had a blacksmith named Curtis Reeves, who was also the town's unofficial philosopher, and liked to hold forth on the nature of frontier justice while shoeing horses. It had a dry goods store run by the Nakamura family, a Japanese father and his American-born children, who had come west with the railroad construction crews in the early 1870s and stayed when they found opportunity in trade, and who had faced no small amount of resistance in doing so, which they had met with patience and commercial excellence until the town had collectively run out of reasons to object. It had a schoolhouse where a young teacher named Miss Parsons managed 23 children of varying ages, with a combination of firmness and genuine affection. And it had, Gertrude gradually came to understand, a ranching economy that ran largely on the work of men like George Holloway, who owned his land outright, had built his house with his own hands starting from a single-room cabin 6 years ago, and whose reputation in the territory was one of absolute reliability. She learned all of this, not because anyone sat her down and explained it, but because the town of Copper Creek talked. It talked over the breakfast table at the hotel, where 3 of the 4 other guests were traveling salesmen who mentioned George's name in the context of contracts and agreements kept. It talked at the dry goods store, where Yuki Nakamura, who was 20 years old and had a quick and generous mind, mentioned George's account in the tone of someone who kept books, and therefore knew exactly who paid when they said they would. It talked in the street, where the blacksmith Curtis Reeves mentioned, while hammering at something with a great deal of force, that George Holloway was one of the few large ranchers in the county who paid his cowboys what he promised without arithmetic that happened to come out wrong at the end of the month. And in between all of this learning, Gertrude spent time with George himself. He came into town on Thursday morning to check on the delivery of some fencing supplies, and he found her at the dry goods store looking at bolts of fabric with the focused attention of a woman who was actually trying not to think about a decision she needed to make. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his hat in his hands, and then he said, "Would you like to ride out and see the ranch?" She turned from the fabric bolt. "I thought you would be busy." "I've done what I came to do," he said. "And it's a good day for it." She rode in the wagon beside him, which was a perfectly respectable way to travel, and which nobody in Copper Creek seemed to find remarkable, though Alma Gentry watched them go from the hotel doorway with a look of quiet satisfaction. The road east from town ran through grassland that rolled and shimmered in the morning heat, and the sky above it was enormous in the way that the Kansas sky was enormous, not threatening, but simply vast, a blue so complete it made the idea of a ceiling seem like something humans had invented to comfort themselves. "Did you always want a ranch?" she asked him, because silence between them was comfortable but conversation was more interesting. "I wanted to have something that was mine," he said, with the kind of honesty that didn't arrive in decorative packaging. "I grew up in Missouri. My father worked land that belonged to someone else his whole life and died with nothing to pass on. I decided when I was about 16 that I was going to own the ground under my feet before I was 30. He paused. "I managed it at 27. "How old are you now?" 31, he said. "4 years of owning the ground under your feet," she said. "How does it feel?" He thought about it genuinely, which she was coming to understand was what he did with most things, thought about them genuinely instead of immediately. "It feels like it changes every season," he said finally. "In spring, when things start growing again, it feels like a kind of miracle. In August, when everything's dry and the cattle are losing condition, it feels like a test. In the fall, when the sale goes well, it feels like justice." He glanced at her sideways. "In winter, it mostly feels cold." She laughed, and it surprised her, because she had not expected to laugh today. She had expected today to be a day of difficult thinking and letter writing and uncomfortable decisions. But here she was, laughing in a wagon on a road through the Kansas grassland with a man she had not known existed 2 days ago. The Holloway ranch came into view around a gentle rise in the land. A wide, low house built of stone and timber with a porch running along its front. A large barn painted the dark red that was universal to barns across the territory. Several outbuildings. A windmill that turned slowly in the prairie wind. And beyond all of it, the land stretching out under the sky with cattle visible in the middle distance, small and dark against the yellow grass. She stood by the wagon for a moment and looked at all of it. "You built this," she said. "Not alone," he said. "I had good men help me, but yes." She looked at the house. The windows were clean. There were flowers growing in a bed along the front of the porch, not planted with any great artistry but clearly tended, watered, cared about. "Who tends the garden?" she asked. "I do," he said, and the simplicity of his answer carried more weight than a lengthy explanation would have. He showed her around the property, the barn where the horses stood in their stalls with the ease of animals that were well cared for, the smokehouse, the root cellar that was cold even in the heat of late summer and smelled of earth and stored vegetables, the kitchen garden behind the house where tomatoes and squash and beans grew in practical rows. He introduced her to his 2 ranch hands, a quiet man named Pablo Ramos, who had come north from Texas and who greeted her with great courtesy, and a younger man named Eli Marsh, who was 19 and seemed genuinely delighted by the presence of any new person, male or female, because Eli Marsh found people endlessly interesting in the way that some people found books or horses interesting. They sat on the porch for a while after the tour, with cups of water from the well, and the afternoon wind came across the grass and the windmill turned, and the cattle moved in their unhurried way in the distance, and Gertrude thought, "I could imagine living in a place like this." And then immediately after the thought, "Which is not the point. The point is that I am going to Millhaven on Friday to marry Edmund Fitch." She looked at George, who was watching the cattle with the easy attention of a man who was simply present in his own life, not performing anything, not explaining himself. He had strong hands resting on the arms of the porch chair, and he was entirely comfortable with quiet, which was not always true of people and was particularly rare in men who had plenty to say. "Why haven't you married?" she asked. The directness of the question startled even her slightly, but she had found that around George Holloway, directness seemed natural. He looked at her sideways, and there was that almost smile again. "Haven't found anyone I wanted to marry," he said. "It seemed dishonest to settle for someone for the sake of having a warm house. A woman deserves better than to be settled for." She was quiet for a moment. "Edmund Fitch wrote to the agency because he needed a housekeeper who came with a marriage certificate," she said slowly. "I think I understood that in some part of my mind when I read the letter. But I told myself it was simply that he was a practical man who didn't believe in romantic flights." "There's a difference," George said carefully, "between practical and cold." "Yes," she said, "there is." She looked out at the land, at the enormous sky, and the long yellow grass and the slow-moving cattle. And she thought about Cincinnati, about the parlor with its careful furniture, and her mother's voice telling her that a woman of 24 who had not yet married needed to be practical about her options. She thought about the letter with its neat handwriting and its description of a comfortable home. And she thought about the way that she had laughed in this wagon this morning, surprised by it, and the way this porch felt like somewhere a person could actually breathe. The stagecoach north was leaving at 8 in the morning on Friday. She had until Thursday night to decide whether she was going to be on it. She was quiet for a long time, and George did not fill the quiet with suggestions or arguments or any pressure at all. And this, more than anything else, was perhaps what helped her think clearly. She went back to town that evening in the wagon, and George walked her to the hotel door, and he held his hat in his hands and said, "Whatever you decide, I hope it's the right thing for you. Not for him. For her." She lay awake for a long time that night. Thursday arrived in a blaze of early sun that turned the dust in the street to gold, and Gertrude rose before the other guests and sat at the window of her hotel room with her letter in her hands and looked out at Copper Creek waking up. Curtis, the blacksmith, was already at his forge. Yuki Nakamura was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store. Two cowboys rode slowly up the main street, heading somewhere with no particular urgency. A dog slept in the shade of the water trough. She thought about what she knew of Edmund Fitch. A neat signature, a catalog of his assets, a description of himself as a gentleman. She thought about accounts that didn't add up. She thought about a woman being settled for. She thought about a man who tended flowers and said, "For you," when most men would have said, "For us." She wrote 2 letters. The first was to Edmund Fitch, direct and honest, informing him that due to a circumstance of incorrect transportation, she had arrived in Copper Creek rather than Millhaven, and that in the time she had spent in reflection since her arrival, she had come to understand that she did not feel that their proposed union would be the honest and mutual partnership she had hoped for, and that she was therefore dissolving their agreement with respect for his time and apology for any inconvenience. She kept it brief and she kept it kind, because she was not a woman who saw cruelty as a virtue. The second letter was to her mother in Cincinnati, which was considerably harder to write and considerably longer, and ended with, "I believe I may have stumbled into something I did not expect. I will write more when I understand it better myself." She sealed both letters and went downstairs to breakfast, and Alma Gentry put a plate of biscuits and gravy in front of her without asking and sat down across from her with a cup of coffee and said, "You're not going to Millhaven." It was not a question. "No," Gertrude said, "I am not." Alma nodded with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen this coming since Wednesday. "Good," she said simply, and refilled her coffee. George came into town that morning for supplies he had not especially needed on Wednesday, which Alma noted with a private smile and said nothing about. He found Gertrude on the boardwalk outside the hotel, her letters already given to the postmaster, her carpetbag at her feet, and a look on her face that was somewhere between terrified and resolved, which was, in his experience, the look of someone who had made a brave and honest decision. He stopped in front of her. He had not rehearsed anything because he was not a man who rehearsed things. "I've decided not to go to Millhaven," she said. "All right," he said. "I've written to Mr. Fitch to inform him of my decision." "All right," he said again. "I find myself in a town I had not planned to visit with no immediate plan forward," she said carefully, "which is either terrifying or the beginning of something, and I cannot yet determine which." He looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "It could be both." "It could," she agreed. He picked up her carpetbag from beside her feet, which she had not asked him to do and which she did not object to. "Alma has a room she rents longer term," he said. "In the back, quieter than the hotel rooms, better light." "You've already spoken to her," she said. "She spoke to me," he said. "There's a difference." She almost laughed again. "There is a great deal happening in this town that doesn't require any of the participants to actually arrange it themselves. It's a small town," he said. "Things arrange themselves." She stayed. She stayed in Alma's back room, which did indeed have better light, coming through a window that faced east and caught the morning sun directly. And she paid a reasonable weekly rate, and made herself useful in the way that Gertrude Barrett tended to make herself useful wherever she was, which was by identifying what needed to be done and doing it without requiring either instruction or praise. Within a week, she was helping Alma with the hotel books, which had been managed with great energy, and almost no actual organization. And within 2 weeks, the system she had put in place had saved Alma $12 that had been lost in the previous system's general optimism about arithmetic. She also began spending time with Yuki Nakamura, who was sharp and funny, and had a perspective on Copper Creek that was simultaneously more clear-eyed and more generous than any other person Gertrude had met there. Yuki's father, Kenji Nakamura, had come to America in 1869 as part of the Central Pacific Railroad labor force and had experienced the full weight of what that meant. The exclusion acts were still in the future, but the present was not gentle, and Kenji had built his store and his life in Copper Creek by making himself indispensable and by cultivating in his children the understanding that excellence was not optional. Because the margin of error available to a Japanese man in 1878 Kansas was considerably smaller than that available to other men. Yuki talked about this with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had grown up knowing the rules of the world and choosing not to be destroyed by them. "My father says the land doesn't care where you're from," she told Gertrude one afternoon, sitting in the dry goods store while the wind picked up outside. "The land just is. It's the people you have to manage." "That sounds tiring," Gertrude said. "It is," Yuki said simply. "But the alternative is to not be here, and I like being here." Gertrude thought about this often. She thought about it especially in the context of her own choice, because staying in Copper Creek had required her to dismantle a plan and accept uncertainty, and uncertainty was not comfortable. But it was, she was increasingly convinced, preferable to the particular kind of comfort that came from settling for something less than true. George came to town most Thursdays and sometimes on Tuesdays, and when he came to town, he invariably found himself in the company of Gertrude Barrett, not because either of them planned it exactly, but because Copper Creek was not large and they had developed an instinct for each other's presence that was neither announced nor avoidable. He began bringing her things from the ranch, not romantic things exactly, not yet, but small and specific things that showed he had been paying attention. A jar of honey from a hive his neighbor kept, because she had mentioned once that she liked honey in tea. A book of botanical illustrations left by a previous occupant of the ranch house, because she had admired the flowers in his garden and he thought she might like to know what they were called. A handful of quartz stones that he had noticed while checking the fence on the north pasture, irregularly shaped and interesting, because she had a habit of picking up stones that interested her and turning them in her fingers, and he had begun doing the same without entirely realizing it. She accepted these things with a pleasure that was quiet and genuine and increasingly difficult to disguise from herself or from Alma Gentry, who had the particular gift of seeing what was obvious without mentioning it until the relevant parties had noticed it themselves. 3 weeks after Gertrude had stepped off the stagecoach, George Holloway asked her if she would like to come to the ranch on Saturday and help him figure out what to plant in the kitchen garden for the fall season. It was, on its surface, an entirely practical request. He needed a second opinion on whether turnips or sweet potatoes were a better use of the remaining bed space given the soil quality and the expected first frost date. She knew gardening from her mother's garden in Cincinnati and had said so. He was aware that it was not entirely a practical request. She was aware of the same thing. "I would like that," she said. She spent the Saturday at the ranch, and it was one of those days that arrange themselves into a kind of wholeness. The kind that feels later like a specific point in time that things can be measured from. They dug in the kitchen garden in the morning and argued cheerfully about the turnips versus sweet potatoes question, and she won, which he conceded with a directness she found entirely refreshing, and they planted sweet potatoes. Pablo made a simple lunch of beans and cornbread that they ate at the outdoor table with Eli, who told a story about a calf that had gotten its head stuck in a fence post hole with such detailed enthusiasm that all four of them were laughing by the end of it. In the afternoon, George showed her how the cattle were sorted and counted, walking her through the process with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted her to understand it, not to impress her, but because sharing something he cared about seemed natural and right. She asked good questions about weights and breeds and the timing of sales, about how prices moved with the season, about the relationship between the rancher and the broker, and he answered all of them with the same thorough honesty he brought to everything. At one point, standing at the fence of the south pasture with the late afternoon sun slanting across the grass, she said, "Do you sell through a broker?" "I did," he said. "I sell direct now. It costs more in time, but the figures come out cleaner." She nodded. She knew from what Alma and Yuki had told her, and from what George himself had carefully not said, that Edmund Fitch's brokerage had caused enough trouble in enough places that several ranchers in the county had made the same calculation. She felt, as she sometimes did when this subject came close, a cold clarity about how different her life might have been, how differently the story might have gone if she had caught the right stagecoach. "I'm glad I got on the wrong one," she said, mostly to herself. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So am I." They were both looking at the cattle, not at each other, and the words landed in the warm evening air and stayed there, and neither of them rushed to cover them over or qualify them, and the cattle moved in their slow, patient way through the yellow grass, and the windmill turned, and the sky overhead was beginning to go gold. She looked at him then, turned from the fence to look at his profile against the evening light, and he turned at the same moment to look at her, and there was nothing complicated in what she saw in his face. It was simply and completely clear. "George," she said. "Gertrude," he said. And then, because the moment required nothing more complicated than honesty, he said, "I would like to court you properly, if that's something you'd consider." She felt the word "properly" settle in her chest like something warm and permanent. Not impulsively, not recklessly, not as a solution to her being stranded in his town, properly, with intention and respect and the full understanding of what it meant. "I would consider that," she said, and the careful formality of her answer made them both smile, and then made them both laugh, and the laughter carried across the pasture, and the cattle lifted their heads briefly and then went back to their grazing. The courtship of Gertrude Barrett and George Holloway was a source of quiet satisfaction to essentially everyone in Copper Creek. Alma Gentry said nothing directly, but began making 2 cups of coffee every Thursday morning. Yuki Nakamura took to having interesting items visible in the front window of the dry goods store on days she knew George would be coming to town, because it gave Gertrude a reason to be in the street when he arrived. Curtis Reeves, the blacksmith, mentioned, while working the forge, that it was good to see people going about things the right way, which was as close as Curtis ever got to romantic commentary. Even Pablo and Eli at the ranch had opinions, which they expressed to each other and not to George, with the discretion of men who valued their employment. George took Gertrude to the harvest dance at the end of September, held in the big barn of the Welland farm just outside of town, which was strung with lanterns and smelled of fresh-cut hay, and had a fiddle player named Thomas Crow, who had been playing the same dances for 20 years and showed no sign of stopping. Half of Copper Creek was there and the other half stopped by at some point during the evening, and the dancing was loud and cheerful and entirely democratic, with the banker's wife dancing next to Pablo's cousin, who had come up from Texas for the season, and Eli Marsh attempting a reel with more enthusiasm than accuracy. George was not a showy dancer, but he was a steady one, and when he put his hand at the small of her back to guide her through a turn, she felt it through the whole of her. They danced 3 dances and then stood together at the edge of the floor drinking cider and watching the others, and she was aware the whole time of his nearness with a precision that was entirely new to her. Between dances, a man she had not met before, heavyset, with the air of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in any room, came up and clapped George on the shoulder with the force of a man who thought of physical contact as a form of assertion. His name was Walt Dunbar, and he ran a cattle operation twice the size of George's north of town. And he had, Gertrude would later learn, a long history of opinions about things that were not his business. Holloway, Dunbar said, with a nodding glance at Gertrude that she found immediately uncomfortable in its assessment. This the woman staying at Alma's. This is Miss Barrett, George said, with an evenness in his voice that was precisely calibrated. Gertrude, this is Walt Dunbar. How do you do? Gertrude said. Dunbar looked between them with a knowing expression that she found even more uncomfortable than the assessment. Well, he said, better you than Fitch, I suppose. At least you'd know what you're getting with Holloway. He said it in the tone of a compliment that had other things underneath it. George said, "Good evening, Walt," in a tone that was perfectly courteous and absolutely final, and Dunbar moved on. What did he mean, Gertrude said quietly, by at least you'd know what you're getting? He means that I'm not a complicated man, George said. He says it like that's a criticism. I take it as a compliment. She looked at him. So do I, she said, and meant it completely. October came in with cooler air and the light changing over the grasslands, going from the harsh gold of summer to something gentler and more complex. And the ranch in October light was a different kind of beautiful than the ranch in August heat. George brought her out on 2 more Saturdays, and on the second one she stayed for dinner, which George cooked himself. A stew of beef and vegetables from the root cellar that was simple and exactly right. And they sat at the table in his kitchen afterward with the lamp burning low, and talked for 3 hours about everything they could think of. He told her about Missouri, about his father's hands, and the way his father had moved slowly, with the tiredness of a man who had worked hard all his life and had nothing to show for it at the end. He told her that he had left at 16 with $40 and had worked on 3 different ranches before saving enough to buy his first 40 acres, and that those first years had been lonelier than he generally admitted, because loneliness and determination felt very similar from the inside, and it was easy to confuse one for the other. She told him about Cincinnati, about a childhood that had been comfortable and careful and slightly airless, about a mother who loved her in the way that a woman who had survived on calculation could love, which was real but which left no room for the unexpected. She told him that she had answered the advertisement in the agency's catalog not purely out of practical necessity, but also out of a desire to be somewhere that the sky did not have a ceiling, which was why the Kansas sky had felt, when she first saw it, like something she had been looking for without knowing it. The ceiling thing, he said, leaning forward on the table. I understand that exactly. I thought you might, she said. She was in love with him. She had been for some time, probably since the Saturday at the fence when he had said, "So am I." But she was a woman who liked to be sure of her own mind before she named things, and she was sure now. She thought he was in love with her too, but George Holloway did things at the pace of a man who was being honest rather than being quick, and so she was patient and she waited. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday in early November, standing in the street outside the hotel in the gray morning light with his hat in his hands. He had not planned a speech. He had, in fact, spent the previous 2 weeks trying to think of the right words and arriving at the conclusion that the right words were simply the true words. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to come and live on the ranch and put your own mark on it and be my wife in every sense of the word. I am not a rich man, but I am a solvent and honest one, and the land is good and it will only get better. I think we are well suited. I think we would have a good life together." He stopped and then added with a directness that went straight through her, "And I love you, Gertrude. That's the part I should have said first." She stood in the gray November street and she looked at his face, which was entirely open to her. No walls and no performances, just George Holloway being exactly what he was, and she said, "I love you too, George, and yes, I will marry you." He exhaled in a way that told her he had been holding his breath for longer than just this morning, and then he smiled, fully, completely, with his whole face, and she understood in that moment that she had not yet seen the full version of his smile before this, and that she intended to spend a very long time seeing it again. He put his hat back on and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the main street of Copper Creek together in the cool November morning, and from the hotel doorway Alma Gentry said, to no one in particular, "Well, about time." They were married in December, in the little church on the east end of Copper Creek's Main Street, which had been built by the town 6 years earlier, and which the minister, a steady and gentle man named Reverend Alcott, kept warm in the winter with a cast iron stove that roared cheerfully in the corner. The ceremony was small Alma, Yuki and her father, Curtis Reeves, Pablo and Eli, and a dozen neighbors and townspeople who came because Copper Creek was the kind of town that showed up for things that mattered. Gertrude wore a dress of ivory wool that Alma and Yuki had helped her make over 3 weeks of evenings, sitting together at the table in the hotel kitchen with fabric spread across every surface, and which was the most beautiful dress she had ever worn, partly because of the quality of the work, and partly because of the company it had been made in. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers because nothing was blooming in December, but George had tied them with a piece of the same blue ribbon that had bookmarked the botanical illustrations he had given her, and she noticed it, and he saw her notice it, and they exchanged a look that needed no translation. He stood at the front of the church with Eli beside him, looking as though his collar was trying to kill him, and when Gertrude walked up the aisle on the arm of Kenji Nakamura, who had offered with such quiet dignity that refusing would have been wrong, George watched her come toward him with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, absolute and complete, and entirely without reservation. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony with warmth and without excess, and when he said, "You may kiss your bride," George kissed her with a gentleness that was also a kind of conviction, and the small church applauded in a way that felt entirely genuine, and outside the windows the December sky was winter pale and enormous. The reception was held at the hotel because Alma insisted, and she produced, with the help of Yuki and 2 neighbor women, a wedding supper that was spoken about for 2 years afterward in terms that approached reverence. There was roasted beef and fresh bread, and preserved fruit, and a cake that Alma had been quietly planning since October, and which demonstrated that Alma Gentry had depths that were not always visible but were very real. Pablo played guitar after supper, a skill nobody had asked him about and which he had apparently possessed all along, and Thomas Crow appeared with his fiddle, and the hotel dining room became, through some natural alchemy of warmth and music and good feeling, the finest party that Copper Creek had seen in several years. George danced with his wife. He held her with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she leaned into him and felt the warmth of his arm around her, and the sound of his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, and thought, "I stepped off a stagecoach into the wrong town and found exactly the right life." They drove out to the ranch that night in the wagon under a sky full of winter stars, wrapped in quilts against the cold, and the house was warm because Pablo had gone ahead and built up the fire in the main room stove, which Gertrude would thank him for every winter for the next several decades without it ever losing its meaning. She stood in the doorway of her own home, hers now, truly, not a hotel room or a back room borrowed from someone else's life, and looked at the warm light, and the simple solid furniture and the shelf, where George's books were lined up beside the botanical illustrations, and the small collection of interesting stones that had been appearing there over the past 2 months, and she felt something settle into place in her chest with a permanence that was entirely new and entirely right. He came and stood beside her. "Welcome home," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for walking toward me." He looked at her. "You were hard to miss," he said simply. She laughed, and he laughed, and they went inside and closed the door against the winter and the past and everything that had been before the wrong stagecoach and the right rancher, and the town she had never meant to find. The first winter of their marriage was, In its way, the beginning of the real story, the one that happened after the decision had been made and the future had become the present. They settled into each other with the ease of people who had paid attention before committing, which made the small daily adjustments of shared life less of a collision and more of a conversation. George rose before dawn every morning, a fact she had known intellectually and which was different in practice, and she rose with him not because she felt she had to, but because she found, to her own surprise, that the early dark was when the house was most itself quiet and warm and theirs, and she liked to be inside it then, starting the stove and making coffee while he went to see to the horses. He came back in smelling of cold air and hay, and drank his coffee standing up with both hands around the cup, and they talked in the half-dark about small practical things that were the actual texture of days, and she found these conversations more satisfying than she had found most conversations that were meant to be important. She organized the house with the same precision she had brought to Alma's books, and George yielded to her systems without argument, because they were better than what had existed before, and he was not a man who kept inferior systems out of pride. She planted early in the spring, adding to the kitchen garden and creating a small cutting garden alongside the porch flowers, which had survived the winter under careful mulching. He watched her work in the garden with an appreciation that had nothing performative in it, and which she felt all the same. In the spring, she began helping with the ranch books in a systematic way. George had kept records in a ledger that was accurate but narratively dense. All the information was there, but following it required a kind of archaeological effort. She created a clear structure, with separate columns for income and expenditure by category, and cross-referenced them with the herd records in a way that made the profitability of each pasture immediately legible. When the spring sale came and George went to negotiate with the buyers in Dodge City, he went with a clearer picture of his position than he had ever had, and the results showed in the final number. He came home from Dodge City on a Tuesday evening and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was satisfaction and something more. "The books made the difference," he said. "I knew exactly what I could take and what I couldn't. The buyer tried twice to come in below the number, and twice I had exactly the figure to say why not. And," she said, "we did considerably better than last year," he said. Considerably. She felt a pride that was partly in her own work and partly in him, in the fact that he had acknowledged it directly and without complication, without needing to arrange it so that his capability contained hers. It was one of the things she was learning about George Holloway. He had no vanity about being helped. He wanted things to go well, and he didn't care about the architecture of credit. The summer of their first full year at the ranch was a dry one, not disastrous, but demanding, the kind of summer that tested the patience of every rancher and the capacity of every well. George managed it with the methodical calm that characterized everything he did, rotating the cattle through the pastures to preserve grass and managing the water with careful attention. Pablo, who had grown up in the Rio Grande Valley and understood dry weather in ways that Kansas ranchers sometimes didn't, was invaluable, and Gertrude found herself grateful for him in a way that went beyond simple employment. He was part of the ranch in the truest sense, and she said so, and Pablo looked at the horizon in the way he did when he was moved and said nothing for a moment, and then said he appreciated hearing that. In the fall of their first year, Gertrude found that she was expecting a child. She told George on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the fall light coming through the east window, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, and then something that was so purely glad that she felt it in her throat, and then a careful steadiness as he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked first. This was the first thing he asked. "I am," she said. "I feel entirely well." "Good," he said, and then his hands tightened on hers and he said, "Gertrude, I am so glad," with a simplicity and completeness that was the most romantic thing she had ever heard, because it was entirely true. She wrote to her mother in Cincinnati. The letter she received back was longer than any previous letter from her mother, and significantly warmer, and contained, buried in its fourth paragraph, a sentence that said, "I believe you have done the right thing, Gertrude, though I admit I did not understand it at the time," which was as close to an apology as her mother was constitutionally capable of, and which Gertrude accepted with full understanding and genuine warmth. Her mother came to Kansas in the spring, which was not something anyone had planned, but which was nonetheless true. Gertrude Barrett arrived on the North Stagecoach, the correct one, the Tuesday stage, in late April, wearing a hat that was magnificently inappropriate for the climate and carrying 2 trunks that had to be brought to the ranch by separate wagon. She was a tall woman with Gertrude's green eyes and an expression of contained assessment that was clearly where Gertrude had gotten hers, and she stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked at everything, the land, the windmill, the barn, the garden, the clean windows, and said, "It's much better than I expected." George, who had been warned in advance and who had prepared for the visit with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, said, "Thank you, Mrs. Barrett. Come inside. Gertrude has been looking forward to this." Gertrude Barrett looked at George Holloway for a long moment with the full force of her assessment, and George returned the look with complete equanimity, and something shifted in Alina's expression that was as close as she generally came to being reassured. She stayed 2 weeks, and she was, in her way, quite useful. She and Gertrude spent long hours together that had a different quality than their previous relationship, more honest, more equal, as though the distance between Cincinnati and Kansas had redistributed the power in a way that allowed them to be more genuinely themselves with each other. Alina had opinions about the baby, about the house, about the management of the kitchen garden, and some of these opinions were useful and some were not, and Gertrude had learned enough by now to tell the difference without distress. On her last evening at the ranch, Alina sat on the porch with George and watched the spring sunset go across the grass, and she said, "You are a straightforward man, Mr. Holloway." "I try to be," he said. "It suits her," she said. "She's always been better with honesty than with prettiness." "I know," he said. "It's one of the things I love best about her." Alina was quiet for a moment. "She wrote to me about stepping off the wrong stagecoach," she said. "When I read it, I thought it was a disaster. I understand now that it wasn't." "No," George said, "it wasn't." Alina left the next morning with slightly less contained emotion than she had arrived with, and she embraced her daughter on the porch of the ranch house with a thoroughness that was not her usual style, and which meant more because of it. The baby arrived in early June in the bedroom of the ranch house, attended by Alma Gentry, who had delivered 9 babies in Copper Creek over the years and who brought to the task the same calm competence she brought to everything. George spent the labor in the main room, which Gertrude could hear him pacing, and when Alma came to the door and said, "You have a son, George," he was through the door before she finished the sentence. He was a boy with George's brown eyes and Gertrude's particular form of absolute focus on whatever was immediately in front of him, and they named him William James Holloway, Will for every day, after George's father who had worked hard and deserved to be remembered. George held his son for the first time with the careful reverence of a large man holding something small and precious, and he looked at Gertrude over the baby's head, with an expression she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for, that same absolute and complete and entirely unreserved love, now expanded to contain this third person who was both of them and neither of them, and entirely himself. "Hello, Will," George said quietly, and then to Gertrude, "Thank you. I think it was both of us," she said. "It was," he said, and sat down on the edge of the bed carefully so as not to disturb the baby, and kissed her forehead and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in the early June light while Will Holloway slept with the absolute authority of a new person who has not yet learned that sleeping is considered remarkable. Will grew with the focused energy of a child who found the ranch a place of infinite interest, which it was, the horses, the cattle, the kitchen garden, the root cellar, the tool shed, all of it fascinating and all of it belonging, in the particular logic of childhood, to him personally. By the time he was 2, he was following George on the morning rounds with the earnest difficulty of very small legs over uneven ground, and George adapted his pace to Will's with the patient naturalness of a father who had decided that the extra time was not a cost but a feature. Eli Marsh, who was now 22 and had settled permanently at the ranch with no apparent intention of ever leaving, took it upon himself to teach Will about horses with a thoroughness that was both touching and, occasionally, logistically complicated, because Eli's enthusiasm had always outrun his sense of what was age-appropriate. Pablo maintained a steady and warm relationship with Will that expressed itself in small practical things: a carved wooden horse, the patient explanation of how a rope worked, a calm word when Will was frightened of something and trying not to show it. The year that Will turned 3, Gertrude discovered she was expecting again, and told George the same way she had the first time, at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and his response was the same: first the question about whether she was well, and then the glad simplicity which she had come to understand was not repetition but constancy. And constancy was something she had learned to value in the way you valued water and good soil, not glamorously but fundamentally. The second child was a girl born in the fall, with Gertrude's green eyes and George's steady temperament, and a disposition toward the garden that was apparent, improbably, almost from the beginning. They named her Clara Eleanor, after George's grandmother and Gertrude's mother, and Eleanor Barrett, who received the letter with her name in it, wrote back at a length that exceeded any previous communication, and with an emotional openness that made Gertrude read the letter twice to make sure she was reading it correctly, and then fold it carefully and keep it in the box where she kept important things. Copper Creek in these years was changing, as the frontier towns of the 1870s and 1880s were changing throughout the territory, growing in some ways, consolidating in others, beginning to develop the permanence that comes when people have decided to stay. The school expanded. A second dry goods store opened on the north end of the street, which Yuki Nakamura observed was a tribute of sorts to the success of her father's enterprise, since it indicated that Copper Creek now had sufficient population to support 2. The railroad reached a junction point 20 miles south, changing the logistics of getting cattle to market in ways that were both lucrative and initially confusing. Curtis Reeves expanded his smithy into a machine repair shop to handle the new equipment that the railroad brought within reach. George adapted to these changes with the same steady methodology he brought to everything, making decisions based on what the land and the market actually required rather than what was exciting or fashionable. He expanded the herd gradually and increased the acreage by purchasing 40 acres of the bordering property when its owner retired and moved to live with his daughter in Topeka. He built a second barn and a proper bunkhouse for the ranch hands, which now included 3 more men in addition to Pablo and Eli. He put in an irrigation system along the southern pasture using the same creek that fed the property's water supply, a project that took most of one summer and produced, in the following dry year, a productivity advantage over his neighbors that was the difference between a hard year and a good one. Gertrude's role in all of this was not the role of a woman whose job was to manage the house and leave the ranch to her husband, though she managed the house with complete competence. Her role was the role of a full partner, which was not always comfortable and not always easy, but was what they had built between them. She kept the books and managed the accounting with a precision that told them exactly where they were at any given time. She made decisions about the kitchen garden and the food supply and the household economy that translated directly into real savings. She developed over the years a relationship with the ranch itself, an understanding of its particular temperament, its weaknesses and strengths, its seasonal rhythms, that was as deep and specific as George's own. They argued sometimes, as people who work closely together and have opinions will argue, about the timing of the cattle sale one year when she believed the price would rise and he believed it would fall, and she was right. About the irrigation project, which she had thought was premature and he had thought was essential, and he was right. About whether Eli Marsh should be trusted with the negotiation of a particular equipment purchase, about which they were both partly right, and which Eli handled with a competence that surprised both of them and required mutual acknowledgement. These arguments were never the kind that put something at risk between them. They were the arguments of equals who respected each other's reasoning and were not afraid of disagreement. And they concluded with the same directness that characterized everything else about George Holloway and the woman who had become Mrs. Holloway by way of a wrong stagecoach on a Wednesday in the fall of 1878. Walt Dunbar, the cattle operator who had made the comment at the harvest dance, fell into significant financial difficulty in the early 1880s, partly as a result of the dry year, and partly as a result of decisions that could charitably be described as overconfident. There was no pleasure in his misfortune, but the county ranching community responded in the way that practical people respond to the troubles of neighbors they have mixed feelings about, with help that is concrete and limited and without lecture, which George organized and Gertrude managed the logistics of, and which Dunbar accepted with the mixed gratitude of a man who had always thought of himself as the giver and not the receiver of such things. It changed Dunbar, slowly and in ways he didn't announce. He became less assertive in his opinions about other people's choices. He paid his men with better accuracy. He sold his northern acreage rather than overextend again. By the time his oldest son was old enough to begin working the ranch, Dunbar had become a different kind of man, not transformed dramatically but recalibrated, which in Gertrude's assessment was more real and more durable than dramatic transformation. Edmund Fitch, she heard through the network of county information that travels the way information in small territories travels through cattle sales and post offices and the patient ears of hotel keepers, had married a woman from Millhaven, and that the marriage had been, by all accounts, difficult. He had also been involved in a legal dispute about his brokerage practices that had ended with a settlement and a reduced operation. She did not feel triumph in this. She felt something quieter and more complex, a gratitude that she could not fully articulate for the specific combination of accident and character that had landed her in Copper Creek instead. Yuki Nakamura married a man named David Calloway 3 years after Gertrude arrived, a cattle buyer's accountant from Wichita who had come through Copper Creek on business and stayed longer than he needed to because Yuki Nakamura was worth staying for. They married in a ceremony that was attended by a large portion of Copper Creek, and which was, in the opinion of everyone present, excellent. The Nakamura-Calloway household became one of the central institutions of the town, with Yuki running the expanded dry goods store and David managing the accounting for several ranch operations in the county, and both of them raising 3 children who had their mother's quick mind and their father's calm persistence. Kenji Nakamura, who had built his life in Copper Creek from almost nothing, lived to see his daughter's wedding and the birth of his first grandchild, and he died in his sleep the following spring at the age of 67, having received what he had worked for, not everything, because the world did not offer everything without reservation, but enough. Enough to have lived with dignity and to have created something that lasted. The whole town came to his burial, and George Holloway gave the eulogy because Yuki asked him to, and he spoke about Kenji with the plain-spoken respect of a man who recognized in another man the same quality he valued most: the willingness to do the work without requiring the world to be fair first. Will Holloway grew from a child who followed his father on unsteady legs into a boy who could ride by the time he was 5, and who could read and do sums by the time he was 6, under the instruction of Miss Parsons at the Copper Creek School, and who had a quality that was recognizably his mother's: A directness of mind that cut through unnecessary complexity and went straight to what was actually there. He was not a gentle child exactly, but he was a fair one, which Gertrude thought was more important. Clara was different from her brother in all the ways that made her completely herself, quieter, more patient, with a love of growing things that expressed itself early and lasted. She followed her mother through the garden with the intense focus of a small person learning the names of things. And by the time she was 4, she knew the difference between a tomato plant and a squash plant, and could tell you which needed more water with an authority that made the adults around her smile, while being careful not to do it where she could see. The summer that Will was 7 and Clara was 4, George and Gertrude sat on the porch of the ranch house on an August evening after the children were in bed, and the sky to the west was going through its full ceremony of color, orange and rose, and a deep purple at the edges, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the windmill turned slowly in the dying wind. George reached over and took her hand, which was something he had done 1,000 times and which had never lost its meaning, and they sat for a while without needing to talk, which was one of the things she valued most about the life she had built with him, the deep comfort of a silence that was full rather than empty. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it sometimes, not out of doubt but out of the habit of checking, of wanting to know, of not assuming that because things looked right they felt right to her as well. She turned to look at him in the evening light. His face had changed over the years in the way faces change when they have spent a great deal of time in open air and work, and feeling deeper lines at the corners of his eyes, which were more often than not the lines of someone who smiled. He was 38 now, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had done the thing he set out to do and had found in the doing of it more than he had expected. "I am very happy," she said. And then, because she was Gertrude Barrett, who had always been better with honesty than with prettiness, more than I thought possible, honestly, when I was sitting in the hotel room the first night in Copper Creek, trying to decide what to do, the future felt very small and very uncertain. I had no way to see anything from there. "And now," he said. She looked out at the sky and the grass and the land that was hers as much as his, that she had put her hands into and her mind into and her years into, and at the window where the lamplight showed through from the room where her children were sleeping, and at the man beside her, whose hand was warm and steady in hers. "Now it feels like it just keeps going," she said, "in the best possible way." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not a thing he did often and was all the more meaningful for that, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together while the sky finished its performance, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plains. The years that followed were the years of building on what had been built, of Will growing into a young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's mind for numbers, who by the time he was 15 was genuinely helping manage the herd records. Of Clara becoming a young woman whose way with growing things had expanded into a knowledge of plants and soil that went beyond the kitchen garden. She could read the grass and the soil in a way that made her genuinely useful when decisions about pasture rotation and planting schedules were being made. Of the ranch itself deepening its roots in the Kansas ground, the stone house expanding with a new wing that George and Will and Pablo built in the spring that Will turned 16, adding 2 bedrooms and a proper library for the books that had been accumulating for years. Eli Marsh had his own story during these years, which wove through the ranch's story in the way that the stories of people who stay do. He had arrived at 19 with enthusiasm and good heart, and he was still there at 30, still enthusiastic and good-hearted, but now also experienced in the specific and irreplaceable way that comes from having done the same important work for many years with increasing competence. He had married a woman named Rose who taught the junior class at the Copper Creek School, and they lived in the bunkhouse's converted end room, which George and Gertrude had helped them make comfortable, and their 2 children played in the same yard as Will and Clara when the ages were close enough for it. Pablo Ramos stayed also, though he made a trip south to see his family in Texas every 2 years, each time returning to the ranch as though he had simply been on an errand and was now back. His knowledge of cattle was as wide as anyone's in the county, and his judgment had never once in all the years been wrong in any way that mattered, and George told him this plainly and often, and Pablo nodded and said, "I know," with a dignity that was entirely genuine. Gertrude wrote to her mother every month without fail, and her mother wrote back, and the letters became over the years a real conversation, not the measured communication of two people managing their relationship from a distance, but the actual exchanges of a mother and daughter who had found, through the unexpected geography of Gertrude's choices, a new way of knowing each other. Gertrude Barrett visited Kansas twice more before her health made travel difficult, and both visits had the warmth and ease of people who had settled into each other finally and completely. She died in Cincinnati in the winter of 1891 at the age of 73, and Gertrude grieved her with the fullness that is possible only when there is no unfinished business, no sentences that were never said, no reconciliations that were never made. George held her through that grief with the same steadiness he brought to everything, not trying to fix it, not moving past it before she was ready, simply being present in the particular way that was his way, warm and solid, and entirely reliable. She was 40 years old in the winter her mother died, and she had been married to George Holloway for 13 years, and she understood by now, with the kind of knowledge that comes from having lived it rather than imagined it, that the quality she valued most in the world was precisely this: someone who showed up completely and stayed. The 1890s came to Copper Creek the way they came to all the frontier towns, with the sense of something turning, the wildness settling into something more established, the open country beginning to be defined by rails and fences, and the growing certainty that the territory was becoming something else. It was not entirely a loss. The school was permanent now, with 3 teachers and 60 students. There was a doctor in Copper Creek, a young woman named Dr. Ida Marsh, no relation to Eli, who had come from the East with a medical degree and a calm determination to be taken seriously, which she achieved through the simple expedient of being excellent at medicine. There was a newspaper. There was a church with a new bell. There was a growing sense that what had been built here was going to last. George sat on the porch on a Thursday evening in the fall of 1893, watching the same sky he had watched for years, and Gertrude sat beside him, and Will was somewhere in the south pasture on horseback, and Clara was inside reading something by the lamp, and the ranch spread out under the evening in its familiar entirety, and George said, "I think we've done all right." "We have," she agreed. "I think Will's going to want to stay," he said. "He doesn't talk about it, but I can see it in the way he works." "He works the way you work," she said, "like the land belongs to him and he belongs to it." George nodded. "Clara will go her own way," he said. "I think she'll go to school somewhere. She has the mind for it." "She does," Gertrude said, "and she should. There's room for both." He looked at her. "You're not worried?" "About what?" "About them leaving, about what happens after." She shook her head. "They don't leave, they grow," she said. "And what happens after is what we've built for them to build on. That's the whole point of it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I was right about you, you know, when I picked up your carpetbag." She looked at him. "What were you right about?" "I knew you were going to change everything," he said. "I didn't know that was a good thing yet, but I knew it." She smiled at him, at the lines around his eyes and the gray beginning at his temples, and the hands that were still the same strong, steady hands she had noticed on the boardwalk outside the general store in October of 1878. A man walking toward her with horseshoe nails under his arm and nothing particularly planned. "I knew you were going to help me," she said. "I didn't know yet what kind of help it was going to be." "What kind did you think?" "The practical kind," she said. "Directions to the hotel, someone to explain about the stagecoach schedule." "And instead," he said. She looked at him across 15 years of Kansas mornings, and kitchen table conversations and planting in spring and selling in fall and children growing and arguments and reconciliations and grief and joy, and all the thousand small things that are the actual substance of a life. Everything else, she said simply. He reached over and took her hand. They sat together until the stars came out. The windmill turned in the evening wind. The cattle settled into their nighttime quiet. The lamp in the window made the house glow against the dark, and inside it, a young woman read her book, and in the distance, a young man rode back toward home across the land that was his inheritance, not just of earth and grass and property, but of the way two people can be in the world together, honestly, steadily, with their whole selves present. The following spring, Clara announced that she had been accepted to a women's college in Lawrence, and the dinner table that evening was full of the particular mixture of pride and feeling that attends such announcements in families that mean what they say to each other. And George sat at the head of his table in his stone house in the Kansas grassland, and looked at his daughter with an expression that said everything he needed to say, and then he said it anyway. "I am so proud of you, Clara. You go and learn everything there is to know." Clara, who had George's steady eyes and Gertrude's direct mind, and 15 years of watching two people love each other with full honesty, said, "I'll come back, you know that." "I know it," he said. Will, sitting across the table with a piece of bread in his hand and the particular ease of a young man who knows exactly where he is going, said, "I'll keep an eye on the turnips." Clara threw a biscuit at him, which hit him squarely, and Gertrude said William James Holloway, in the tone that had been deployed for 16 years without ever quite succeeding in its objective, and George laughed, and the kitchen was warm and loud and entirely itself. That summer, Gertrude planted a new garden bed along the east side of the house, in a spot that had good soil, and caught the morning light she still loved best. 20 years after the first morning, she had sat at an east-facing window in Alma Gentry's back room and looked out at a town she had never meant to arrive in. She planted it with the botanical names she now knew as well as her own lavender and sage and wild roses, and the sweet potatoes she had won the argument about all those years ago, and a new variety of squash she had read about in an agricultural periodical and wanted to try. George found her there one morning, crouched at the soil with her hands in it, and he stood at the edge of the new bed and watched her work with the same expression he had worn for 20 years when she wasn't looking, a look of such complete and particular love that it was almost too much to see. She looked up and caught him at it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She sat back on her heels and looked at him in the morning sun, at the man who had been walking toward her that day without knowing it, and who had handed her a cup of lemonade and sat down across from her and said, "You look like someone who might be needing some assistance," and who had not once, in all the years since, needed to be anything other than exactly what he was. "Come help me plant these," she said. He came and crouched beside her, and she showed him where the lavender needed to go, and they planted it together in the Kansas morning while the windmill turned and the cattle moved in the distance and the house stood solid and permanent behind them, and their life went on the whole, complete, closed. An entirely beautiful life that had begun on a Wednesday afternoon with a wrong stagecoach and a right man, walking around the corner of a general store with horseshoe nails under his arm and everything ahead of him.